All right, it is noon Eastern time. Let's go ahead and get this thing kicked off here. We're going to go through some slides, and then we're going to do some live coding. And then after that, we'll take questions, and we can do question and answer up till 1:30 Eastern time if people have questions. Once we're out of questions, we'll go ahead and stop the actual webinar itself. If you do have a question as we're going through, there's a questions box as part of the webinar experience that you can go in there and actually type in your questions. I probably will not be answering questions as I go along. I'm going to wait until the end to answer those. But if you want, you can type in the questions as we go along, and then I will take a look at those once we get to the end of the actual presentation itself. Also, everything that you're going to see here in terms of the slide deck, the code, and everything will be made available to you, including an audio recording, after the webinar is over. So if you get pulled into a meeting or lunch or what have you, you can always come back and watch this again. We want to thank you guys for making time out of your day to come out here and be a part of this. So let's go ahead and get started here. So our webinar today is going to be on Introduction to GraphQL. We're going to have kind of a high-level discussion about what GraphQL is, the problems that it solves. We'll do a little bit of implementation details with a JavaScript-based GraphQL server written in Node. We'll write some queries, and then we'll do some mutations as well. And then at the end, we'll kind of just tie it quickly into a React component. For those of you who might be familiar with GraphQL, we're not covering Apollo or Relay or any of those other libraries in this particular presentation. We're just going to be focused in on GraphQL itself. All right, so what exactly is GraphQL? GraphQL is basically an API for your data. The best way to think of GraphQL is it's like SQL for your data services. So if you think about working with REST services or even SOAP, if you're still working with older APIs, for those particular ways of working with data, you're basically limited to what it wants to give you. You're limited to the structure that it provides you with. So if you want to pull back, like say, a record of data, or you want to pull back some type of resource, you're not only limited to what that resource is, but you're also limited to the fields that it wants to give you. You can't request fewer fields, and you can't request more fields. You literally just get what you get. And this actually proves to be a problem in modern UI development, because in modern user interface development, a lot of times we're trying to consume the same data endpoints on multiple UI platforms. And in a desktop environment, I might want more data, but for my mobile application, I might want less data. So the restrictions that we have with basically a one-size-fits-all approach with REST services, for example, doesn't really work all that well. But if you think about it, SQL is significantly different than a REST service. With SQL, the database doesn't just give you the whole table or give you all of the columns of a table. You actually tell it that you want the name column and the price column and the ID column, and those are the only ones that you get. Well, GraphQL works in a similar manner. With GraphQL, you basically get a query language that's more or less standardized, that allows you to tell the data service what exactly you want, and then the data service can return that back to you. So with GraphQL, the client kind of drives what they want. You're not limited to a particular row or a single resource like you might be with a REST service type situation. So with GraphQL, they're really superior to REST services in terms of querying data, because you only have to request the data that you need. You can actually combine multiple resources into a single request, and that's because GraphQL is basically the concept of a graph of nodes, and so you can pull in the nodes off the graph that you want. Mutations are not tied to the HTTP verb system. All of us are familiar with the traditional CRUD operations that we encounter with working with REST services. For example, a GET request is going to get us data. A post against the collection URI inserts a new record. put against an element URI is going to replace or insert a record. A delete operation against the element URI deletes stuff. And then a patch does an update. We have these verbs that are basically translated to the specific types of mutations that we want to perform. But a lot of times we want to do things more than just basic CRUD operations. And so when we want to do more than that, we actually have to go through a whole lot more effort to kind of come up with some type of internal in-house convention for how we're going to structure these other operations, and it can be a real pain. With GraphQL, you simply just define the function that you want to perform, and then you can perform it. There's no need to try to map it to the HTTP verb system and things like that. Queries actually follow a standard. So GraphQL was created by Facebook, but it was actually released as a standard. So later on, we'll talk about how you can use any language you want to implement your GraphQL server, so long as it works with the GraphQL syntax. So the actual queries themselves follow a standard. You know, a lot of folks like convention-based programming in the sense of it avoids having to do a lot of configuration. But the problem with convention-based programming is the way one organization does something, for example, REST services, could be different than how another organization does similar REST services. So there's nothing consistent across the board. And that also makes it a little bit harder then to build, you know, really nice APIs for working with REST services beyond simply just wrapping an AJAX operation. With GraphQL, because the queries follow standards, a number of really nice libraries have popped up like Apollo and Relay that can leverage all types of really cool caching systems and things like that that make it easier to build these larger scale applications using this really flexible query language. Now, one of the reasons why REST services are so popular is because if you've got a very simple REST client, or in the case of a GET request, simply a web browser, it's really easy just to make a GET request with a URL and get some data, or to do a POST request and do an insert. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why REST services became so much more popular than working with SOAP, because SOAP had a really complicated syntax. GraphQL has a very easy to use syntax as well. In fact, most of this webinar, we're simply just going to be writing GraphQL syntax. And you're going to see how easy it is to be able to make use of GraphQL in your applications. Now, even though GraphQL is better than REST services, to adopt GraphQL doesn't mean you have to go back and rewrite your entire enterprise architecture. With GraphQL, you can adopt it incrementally, and you can actually use it to wrap your existing data services. So if you have existing REST services, existing SOAP services, other types of data services over the network in your organization, you can wrap all of that in GraphQL and expose their endpoints through GraphQL, which means that it's not a total rewrite. Instead, you can slowly adopt it and incorporate it more and more into your applications. And it actually works really well for that. In fact, in a lot of places where I teach GraphQL, the thing that they're doing is actually taking their existing REST service operations and then wrapping them and putting a thin layer in front of them that actually do the GraphQL part. And so from that perspective, it's actually really nice. Now, GraphQL supports 3 different kinds of queries. One of them is retrieving data. Just kind of think of like a SQL select type of operation. Another one is a mutation. And mutations can kind of cover a whole broad range of queries. It could be anything from inserting data to updating information that's already there, deleting data, and any type of mutation that you could think of for your data within your application fits into this mutating data category. And then we have introspection queries. Introspection queries are cool because it allows you to actually get information back from GraphQL about your various GraphQL types, how your nodes are connected, all that kinds of stuff. These introspection queries will not be a huge part of what we talk about today, but when you start embracing libraries and frameworks like Apollo and Relay, these introspection queries become extremely helpful in terms of writing your queries and understanding the structure and doing validation on your queries within your source code. And so that's one of the more powerful things actually about GraphQL are the introspection queries and what you can do with those in terms of understanding the actual shape and structure of your GraphQL server. All right, GraphQL has its own type system. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, GraphQL itself is not tied to a particular programming language, either on the server or the client. GraphQL is a standard that exists independent of what language is actually implemented in. Now, the creator of GraphQL, Facebook, has a lot of data, and a lot of their data fits into a large graph, which is why they came up with something. Hold on. Let's see, I have a question. Are you seeing a browser? You should see my slide deck. I have a slide deck up here. You should see that. I think my question asker, yeah. Can somebody raise their hand? Can you see my slide deck? If you can, raise your hand. Okay, so people are seeing the slide deck. Okay, great. All right, cool. Yeah, only the browser. Now, can you guys see my screen? Okay, gotcha. Thank you for asking that question. I apologize. I thought I hit play on the thing. Well, the slide deck was distributed ahead of time. Basically, this is what you missed. Just a couple of bullet points here on working with different resources and stuff like that. For some reason, it said it was sharing, but it wasn't. But sorry about that. Okay, so back over to our sophisticated type system. Okay, so GraphQL is not limited to a particular programming language. It's just a standard independent of what language it's implemented in, okay? So it can be implemented in JavaScript if you want to have a node-based backend system. It can be implemented in Java, .NET, Python. If you actually go out and kind of Google around, you'll find a ton of different languages that GraphQL itself can actually be implemented in. The types provided by GraphQL are not tied to the language's types. So, for example, in JavaScript, when you deal with numbers, you only have a number type. Okay. However, in GraphQL, they actually have an int type and they have a float type. Okay. And so even though JavaScript only supports numbers, GraphQL itself supports those two types of numbers. And so the type system in GraphQL has been designed for what's best for GraphQL, not what has been specifically designed for a particular language implementation. And then, of course, as writing your code for your GraphQL implementation, you have to take into account what those specific types are, and then make sure you return data for GraphQL that actually satisfies those types. GraphQL supports a bunch of different types of types. It supports a variety of what we might call primitive types, string, number, or not in the string, float, int, Boolean. It supports enums, supports object types. You use a lot of object types when building GraphQL servers. It also has support for things like interfaces and union types and that kind of thing as well. All right. When you go to consume GraphQL with a web application, the results are returned back in a JSON format. So whatever system you're working with on the client side needs to be able to understand JSON. Now, of course, in a web browser, that's not a big deal because the JSON itself is what you use when building web applications, and the JavaScript environment natively understands it. But when you work with GraphQL, you have to be able to parse that JSON format to be able to make use of the results. When you make your calls to GraphQL, you can use the same type of libraries and stuff that you would use when making REST service calls. You can use the XHR object. You can use the newer Fetch API. If you're using some type of other library that wraps those lower level functions, you can use that as well. Because at the end of the day, it's just a straight up HTTP request to the server to be able to pull down the actual GraphQL results. All calls to GraphQL are going to be a post request. So you don't have to get into all the details of which verb to use in terms of working with HTTP. All of them are going to be post requests. And the reason that all of them are post requests is all of them have an actual request body. So even when you're issuing a query, it's not a URL-based thing. It's actually a request body thing in the post of the request. When you build your queries, you can actually have a query and then have a separate set of variables that are then passed into the query. So you don't have to hard code all the variable values into your query when you build it. You can actually create a query and then have a separate set of variables that are then applied to it. The two big programming clients for GraphQL that exist are Apollo and Relay. Apollo is kind of a general purpose, third-party GraphQL library. They have a lot of cool development tools and other stuff on their website. And you can actually use it to integrate GraphQL into a React application, into an Angular application, really into anything. You can also use it for doing things like React Native programming or iOS development. You can use Apollo to integrate GraphQL into those. Relay is a Facebook creation. It's their framework for working with basically React and GraphQL and connecting the two of them together. Relay is pretty cool, but it's kind of hard to set up. It's a little bit complicated to set up, but it's actually really cool once you get it up and working. Both Apollo and Relay support things like caching and stuff like that. One of the things you'll start to realize when you're working with GraphQL is because you can pull down all these different parts of the graph, it actually becomes beneficial to be able to cache all those different parts of the graph so you don't have to constantly go back and requery the same data over and over again, especially if it's not changing, right? Apollo and Relay help you to do that. Okay, so those are definitely two technologies that if you decide to go forward with GraphQL, you'd want to take a look at. If you're going to go with just straight up React, you probably would want to look at Relay. If you're going to be trying to go with Angular or doing some iOS development, you'd probably want to take a look at Apollo. But ultimately, syntax differences aside, they basically do the same thing. And they're both very, very helpful for being able to do your programming. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to dive in to some code. And we're going to take a look at building a little GraphQL server using Graphical, which is the built-in client that comes with a lot of the GraphQL servers. Take a look at querying for data using some query variables. We'll take a look at mutating data, a couple of advanced query features, and then we'll quickly populate a React component just so you can kind of actually see it in action and kind of see the whole thing put together. So let's go ahead and get started writing some code for that. And then once we're done writing the code, then we'll take some questions and stuff. So as we're going along, don't hesitate to put some questions into the question box, and we'll take a look at it. All right, so let me move this out of the way. And what I've got here is I've got a standard kind of homegrown project that I use for my classes that I teach in terms of working with React and working with GraphQL and Relay and stuff. And so over here, you'll see a ton of files. I'm not going to take the time to walk through all of these. All these files will be pushed up to the server, so you can absolutely take a look at them on the server if you would like and walk through them. But I'm not going to walk you through all the details. We're going to focus here exclusively on the GraphQL side of things. So here I've got a little index.js file underneath my server folder, which is basically my starting file here for setting up our little GraphQL server. There's really not a whole lot going on here that we really have to think about or deal with, but I'm going to walk you through a little bit of it here. So this is based off of an Express application, so we're using the Express web framework. GraphQL has some Express middleware that has been created for it. And so basically, we're just firing up an Express application and then including that middleware here as part of our Express application. When you work with GraphQL, you'll have something called a schema. And the schema is basically going to have all of the types and stuff and all the relationships between the types that GraphQL is going to be using. And so we're going to import that schema, and we're going to register that here with our middleware. And then here we've got a couple of additional little options that will do some prettifying of the JSON, also turning on the graphical client itself so that we can make use of it. And then we have some context here for actually talking back to our REST service. And then down here, we're just simply firing up the application. So you can see not really a whole lot of code here that we have to do, just a little bit of configuration to bring GraphQL to life. Now down here, I already have our server running. So I'm going to come over to our web browser, and let me organize my windows here quickly. All right, so on localhost 3020 is where I'm running my GraphQL server. And as you can see here, when I reload this, you get this nice little editor. This is the graphical editor. This has to be one of the coolest things about working with GraphQL out of the box, is having this actual client tool directly built into the server that you can then access from your web browser. But it gets even cooler than that. Let's say we want to do ourselves a little query here. So I'm going to come into here. I'm going to type in a query, and then I'm going to start typing message. What do you notice pops up? It's IntelliSense. It's not even just IntelliSense, but you actually get a full set of documentation that shows you the structure of your GraphQL server. And as we actually start to build this thing out a little bit, you're going to see increased documentation show up over here in our documentation for our schema. So right out of the box with GraphQL, you get this really nice environment that you can work at or work with for free. Over here, there's also a history where you can see a history of all of your queries. So let's come in here and type in one. Message, we'll run it. You can see there's my history. There's my message data that comes back from my query. It's really, really nice. Down here, we'll talk about this here shortly, but these are query variables. We can actually specify the variables here for our query. And let's say we came into here and we kind of wrote like an ugly looking query. I can come over here and click prettify, and it'll actually make it look pretty. Now you'll see it got rid of the word query there, because in graphical, you can actually leave query off of your query, and it will assume by default it's a query. But just from force of habit, I always type out my actual query word whenever I do my queries. But there you go. So this is the graphical client that you get to work with, which is actually pretty cool. Okay, so let's take a look at what's powering the delivery of this data here, hello world. So if we go back over to our editor, you will see here inside of my server folder, I have a types folder. In the types folder, I have query type. All GraphQL servers have a top-level query type, okay? And that query type is going to be the starting place that we're going to use for doing all of our data retrieval. In a little bit, we'll create a second top-level type, which will actually be our mutation type. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our structure here. We're starting off with a GraphQL object type. So the query type is always going to be this GraphQL object type. Just think of the GraphQL object type as like a generalized object for defining a type in GraphQL. And then we're going to take that generalized object and we're going to add fields to it, which will then have their own specific types. Every type that we create with the object type is going to have a name. So in this case, the name of our type is query. We can also specify a description here. Using the description in a real application is a best practice. Why? Because over here, you can actually see that description inside of our documentation. So when you're actually looking at your schema and looking at the docs, you can actually populate all of this with information about your schema. Here we have our fields. The fields are going to be the things that we can query off of the query object. So in this case, we have a field called message. If you come back over to our query over here, you'll see here we have message. So this message right here directly corresponds to the message field that you see here. Now, each field has to have a type that it returns. In this case, this particular field is returning back a GraphQL string type. Let's say we wanted to return back an integer instead. Well, we could come up here and we could import this and we could say int and then take our GraphQL int, set that there, and then we'll just return back a number, say 42. So there's our number 42. You'll notice I have my server configuration set up to actually restart the server on all of these changes. The restarting of the server down here in the terminal has nothing to do with GraphQL. It's just purely how I have my project set up and configured. Okay, so let's go ahead and reload now our page. If we go over to query, you'll see message is now an int instead of it being an actual string. And so if we query message, you'll see over here we have message and the value 42 comes back. So by simply making a change to our type or making a change to our resolve function, we can start to change the structure as well as the data being returned from our GraphQL server. Now, this resolve function is a really, really important function. This resolve function has the logic that tells GraphQL how to fulfill the data needed to populate our type. So in this case, when you request the message field, we're telling it to supply the data based upon what this resolve function is doing. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, or maybe you're not familiar with the latest versions of JavaScript, this thing right here is a function. So this is actually called an arrow function in JavaScript. And so our arrow function, this would be the actual parameters, which there are none. And then this would be the return value that's being returned back. We could also, for example, make it have a statement body and say, return 42, same concept there. So we could save that, come back over to here, run it, still get the same result. Okay, so now we have ourselves our query object. Now what we want to do is start to expand this out a little bit and have it do something kind of interesting. So what I've done is I have some data here set up in a database where I've got, or a little JSON file actually, where I've got a bunch of author and book data. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an endpoint here to our query where we can actually query some of that author and book data and then be able to see it in the graphical client, okay? This DB-JSON is being powered by a REST service thing called JSON server. So here's JSON server. You can see all of my little endpoints that I have here set up on it. Everything from to-dos to colors to cars to widgets to people to authors. This JSON server, if you've never heard of it before, is really awesome. If you need to stand up a traditional REST service in like 30 seconds or less with all the built-in operations, cores, and you want to power the whole thing off of a JSON file, this is what you should use. I use this for all of my classes. It works fantastic. We don't waste time configuring databases or anything like that. You want to check out the JSON server. It's really, really nice. Now, back over here to our code. What we want to do is we're going to want to return some of these books back. So we're going to come over to our query type here, and let's go ahead and write some code to return back some books. So we're going to come down here and add a new field called books. Now, books are going to be returning back a list of a book object type. So we're going to have to do a couple of things here. We're first going to have to create the book object type. Then we're going to have to create an actual list of those book object types. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to come over to types and we'll create ourselves a new file. And we're going to say book-type.js. Awesome. Now we'll come into here, we'll say import from GraphQL. Now, if you happen to be doing the JavaScript implementation of GraphQL, What's really nice about it is everything gets exported as what's known as a named export. And if you type from GraphQL here first and then come back over here, if you've got a good editor, I've got Visual Studio Code here. It's got great code completion and IntelliSense. I can actually, should be able to type GraphQL object type. Well, my IntelliSense is not working. That's how presentations go, right? But it is called GraphQL object type, and you typically do get really awesome IntelliSense. I'm going to have to figure out why that broke. But there's our GraphQL object type. And so now we're going to say export const, and we're going to create ourselves a book type. And we'll say new GraphQL object type. There we go. Now, as I mentioned, all types have to have a name. So we'll say name, book. We can throw a description on here. This will be the only description I put in because we don't want to waste time, but just to have a description here, we'll say a book. There we go. Now let's go ahead and do some fields. All right. Now, if we come over to our DB.json, we're going to see that we have a couple of fields set up. We have an ID, a title, a category, and a price. We'll come back to author ID here in a moment, but let's go ahead and do these four. So ID, title, category, and price. So ID is a number, which is an int, price is a float, and then title and category are both strings. So let's go ahead and do our first field here. And this is going to be a type, and we'll say GraphQL int, and let's go ahead and grab GraphQL string and GraphQL float. So now we're going to take our GraphQL int here. We'll set up our type. You can specify a description here if you want. We're not going to, but you can specify a description. I'm then going to do my resolve here. So there's my resolve. Now, for our resolve, we can pull in the data of the book through the first parameter. So for example, I could say book, and then I can have it return back book.id. Now, because this ID property here corresponds to this ID property here, I can actually skip the resolve function itself, and our little GraphQL thing will handle this automatically because the ID names are the same. While we're at it, we'll go ahead and add the remaining ones. So we've got that. We'll say type GraphQL string. And then after our title there, we'll do our category. Say type GraphQL string for that one. And then finally, we have price, and we'll say type equal to GraphQL float. Okay, so there's our book type that we've created. Pretty simple, huh? So we'll go ahead and save that. And then we're going to take our book type here, and we're going to import this over to query type. So we'll say import book type from /book type. We'll also need to pull in our GraphQL list. So GraphQL list. And then we're going to take our list here, and we're going to come down to books, and we'll say type new GraphQL list book type. So what this is going to do for us is this is going to allow us to have a list of book types that we can return back. Now, unlike the book type where we could skip the resolve functions because the names of the book properties corresponded to the names of the fields, over here, we're actually going to have to make a call to our REST service to load up the data that we're going to need. So if we come back over to our REST service, we could actually come in here and say books, and you'll see we get back a list of our books. So I'm going to grab our URL for our books and then come back over here, And let's go ahead and take a look at how we can fulfill the data for this. So we'll say resolve, boom. And we're going to need to pull in some actual book data to be able to populate this. All right. So we are going to pull in something called node fetch. It just basically gives us the fetch API from the fetch API so we can make use of it here inside of our application. So we're going to say fetch, because remember, fetch is a web browser thing, but there's actually an equivalent version of it available in Node through this third-party Node fetch library. So inside of here, we're going to say return fetch, and then we can actually fetch back our data. So we'll paste our, we'll paste our URL in there. Looks like I copied that. Grab that, paste it in there. We'll wrap it in quotes. Then we're going to do our .then res JSON. All right. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to actually return back our actual books here. Now, we should actually be able to leave it at this, because the res JSON is going to take our book JSON structure that you see here and actually return this back and populate our book type that you're going to see here. And then we should get back our actual array of books. So let's go ahead and save all of that. That looks good. All right. Now let's come over to here and let's reload our GraphQL server. So if you come over to our documentation explorer, you'll see that we have our books, and there's our type book that's coming back, and there's all the fields for it. You can see if we had put descriptions there for all the different fields, that would be helpful for using the documentation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come into here and we'll say books. Now we can come in here and we can start specifying the fields. And so we get the good IntelliSense here. We can say title, what have you, category, and then price. And then we should be able to call this and get back our books, which we did. So if you take a look here, you'll see now we're getting back our books. Now imagine we were building a mobile app, and for whatever reason, we didn't want to get the category information back. Instead, we just wanted the title and the price. Well, if we were working with traditional REST services, we would be stuck. We'd have to get the whole piece of data back, the whole set of data, even if we didn't want a particular field. But because we're using GraphQL, we can actually come in here and we could actually run our query like this, and now you'll notice we're getting a smaller set of data back. So as you can see, this is a huge benefit. We didn't have to go back to the REST service team and beg and plead for our special endpoint. If we're coding the REST services ourselves, we didn't have to go and create another customized endpoint. Through using this little query language, we could instantly limit our data set. Now, this is bringing back a whole set of books, but what if I wanted to bring back a particular book based upon ID? So let's go back over here to our editor, and let's go ahead and set up an endpoint for that. I'm going to take our books one that we already coded. There we go. And I'm going to set it up so that I can query a particular book. The return type is obviously not going to be a list. It's just going to be a single book. But I am going to have to support some args. Args are basically just the arguments that you would pass into your GraphQL query. So I'll say args. And then for our args here, we're going to specify the actual ID. So we'll say ID, and then we'll do a type. And then for our type, we'll say GraphQL int. Of course, you could specify a description here too for the args. Really nice to be able to define clearly for the consumer of your service what the actual data that's expected to be passed in is. And then we can come down to here and we can actually reference this arg. So the argument that you get here, the first argument, is going to be the actual data that we're populating the query with. So if there was actually such a thing as query data, that would be coming in there. But there is no actual query type data. The data that we're pulling in just comes in off of these functions. So instead of trying to reference query data, we want to reference our args. The args will come in as the second parameter here. So we can say args, and then we can take our args here. We can come down to our REST service, and we'll just simply come into here and specify our args. And we're going to pull back a single book. So this REST service follows all the standard conventions, right? So if we came over here and literally said books/8, you get back the one book. So what we're doing over here now is we're modifying our URL to specify the one book. And by the way, that should be args.id, not just plain old args. So args.id, and then we can pull that back. In fact, one cool thing that you can do with this is you can actually just do some destructuring. So for those of you who are familiar with JavaScript, we could just use some destructuring here and then just specify ID directly like this. And that saves us a little bit of typing. So now I have my server set up to be able to return back a single book. Let's head back over to GraphQL. Now, each time you modify the schema, the server restarts, and it will still let you run queries and stuff in GraphQL, but you should notice that we don't have our new endpoint showing up yet. The only way GraphQL gets the new endpoint is if you actually reload GraphQL. So if you refresh this page, now you'll see on query that we now have our new endpoint for retrieving a particular book here. So now we can actually do a little query to get back a particular book. Let's come in and say ID, which is just books, or book ID. And let's pull back book number 8 and run our query. And now we get back the quiet ones. All right. So now we're able to pass in some arguments here and be able to pull back a particular book. Now, one cool thing that we can actually do here is we can actually set this up to be a variable. All right. To make it set up to be able to handle a variable, we're going to have to give our query what's known as an operation name. So for example, I could say get book by ID. This operation name really has nothing to do with the actual code that we wrote on the server side. It's just something we have to specify here so that we can actually declare a variable. So I'm going to create a variable here called book ID, and I'm going to make it of type int. And then I'm going to take book ID here and use that to populate my ID on book. You'll notice the int here will correspond to the int that you see over here in our field definition. That's because I want to use book ID to be able to populate my querying for a particular book. Then we'll come down here to our query variables, and then I can then say book ID. Look how fast that IntelliSense is. The IntelliSense on query variables is awesome, but sometimes you'll get a little ahead of yourself typing, and it actually causes more of a problem, but it's actually really cool. So we'll say 8 for our book ID, issue the query, and now we get the same book back. If I were to change it to 9, I now get debating silence. So using the variables here combined with my query operation, I can basically store this as a string and then swap out my query variables that I'm going to use for actually issuing queries against the server. So this is one really cool thing that you can do here with GraphQL. And what I'm going to do here is actually take this query, come over to here, and in our source code here, I'm just going to drop that query in there and comment it out. That way, if you would like to try this out on your own after the webinar is over, you've got the actual query syntax. Whoops. Right there for you. Okay, cool. So there's our actual query for that. So that's an example of pulling in the books and pulling in a particular book by ID. Now, the real power of GraphQL isn't just simply returning back a single item. We can do that with REST services or any number of other data service options. The real power of GraphQL is in the name graph, in that you can have a graph of nodes. So what I want to set up here quickly for us is just a very simple graph of nodes that we can use for pulling back a book plus the author. So if you look at our DB.json file, you'll see there's an author ID, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. And then at the top here, we actually have a bunch of authors loaded into the system. So we're going to write a little bit of code here to tie the two of these together quickly. So inside of types, I'm going to create a new file called authortype.js. So there's author type. And I'm just going to come over and grab the code here for book type, paste that in here to author type. And we're going to make a couple of changes. We'll make this author type. We'll give it a name of author. We'll say an author. And then for our fields, we have ID, which is going to be the same as before, but then we have first name and last name. So we'll just change title to be first name and category to be last name. Get rid of the price field. And let's go ahead and do that. Kind of clean the code up there a little bit. OK, so now I've got my author type. Pretty quick to do, right? So let's come over to book type. And let's set it up so that we can actually return back the author information. We could come in here and add an actual property called author ID. If you go over to DB.json, you in fact will see there is an author ID. So we could actually have a type here. We could say type : GraphQL and then have our author ID. But we could actually return back the whole author too, which is way cooler. So we're going to say author. And then we need to import our author type. So we'll come up to here. We'll say import author type, actually author type from /author type. There we go. We're going to grab author type here, come down here and say type : author type. Then we need our resolve. Now I had mentioned to you a few moments ago that the first argument here is the data used to populate this type. I had talked about it with query type and said there was no data. But for book type, we actually do have data. So I can come into here and I could say book, which will be the actual book. And then I could write myself a little GraphQL query or a little fetch operation to the REST service to get my author data. So we'll just come back over here to query type. I'll grab this piece of code right here. Pop that into there. Also, I'll grab my import statement as well. Copy that. Paste that into there like that. And then come back over to here. And we're going to say authors / and then we'll do our book.id or book.author ID. So check that out. Now, using the book's author ID, I have a resolve operation that knows how to get the data to populate an author. Okay? So if I save that, everything looks good. We come back over to here. Let's reload graphical. Now, if you come over to our query, you'll see we have books and book. But click on the book type. You'll now see there's an author ID, and there's also an author. If you click on author, there's your author data. So I'm going to take our query that we wrote here a moment ago, and I'm just simply going to say author, first name, run it, and there's our first name for our author. So now we have the ability to be able to pull in the data that we want off of the book. So now instead of making a REST service call for books and then a second REST service call for authors, I can now set up my query to pull in all of that data pretty easily. And that makes your life a whole lot easier, right? You can shape this data the way that you want it, okay? So there's an example of making an actual connecting one node to another and being able to pull in all of that data. We want to do one additional little thing here, though, before we switch over to coding up a little bit of React code. I do want to do a mutation for you. I know we're down to 10 minutes before we get to 1, but I'd like to do the mutation for you here real quick, and then we'll take any questions that we have. At the moment, we don't have any questions, so I'm just going to do this. If you do have any questions, though, please go ahead and put them in the question box. That way, when we get to the end of the presentation, I can answer them. All right, so let's set up a mutation. To set up a mutation, we're going to add a new file in here called mutation type.js. And then for our mutation, this is also going to be another GraphQL object type. So we'll say import GraphQL object type from GraphQL export class, and we'll say mutation, actually export const, mutation equal to new GraphQL object type, boom. We'll say name, and then for this, we're going to call it mutation. We'll skip the description, and then we're going to have our fields. Now, before we actually fill out the actual fields and stuff here, we're going to take this mutation, and we're actually going to import it into our schema file. So here's our top-level schema file. We'll say import mutation from ./types/mutation type, and then we'll simply register this mutation using a shorthand property in JavaScript. We'll just register it with our GraphQL server here. And now we'll jump back over to mutation, and we'll go ahead and set up one little mutation. We're going to do an insert book mutation. We're just going to insert the actual book itself, all right? So to do this, we're going to need to create a little function on here that we're going to call insert book. Now this field is going to be just like every other field. It'll have an actual type, but the type is actually going to be the return type, not the type of the data we're passing up. That'll be specified in args. So I'll come into here, and I'm going to say import, and we're going to pull in our book type from ./book type. There we go. And then we'll take our book type here, and we're going to do this. And then for our type here, then we're going to go ahead and specify some args. So there's our args there. And now we need to actually specify the input type that we're going to use to pass up. The GraphQL object type really can't be used for doing inputs. You have to use a special input object type. So let's go ahead and pull that one in. So we'll come over to here. We're going to create a new file, and we'll say book input type.js, and we're going to import GraphQL input object type from GraphQL, and we'll say come down here and say const book, actually export const book input type equal to new GraphQL input object type. And then here we'll do our name. We'll just say book input. And then we'll have our fields. Now our fields for this are actually going to be the same fields that we have for book type minus the ID. So let me just come up here. I'll grab the fields here. So we've got title, category, price, and author ID. I'll come over to mutation type, or to not to our mutation, to our book input type. And I'll paste that in there like that. Let's go ahead and do our imports for our string, for our float, and for our int. Okay, so we've got our string, float, and int there, all right? And now what we're going to do is we are going to set this up so that we can use this to actually do our actual arguments for our mutation. So we've got our book input type. We're going to take this and we'll come over to our mutation type. And we're going to say import book input type from /book input type. And we'll take our book input type here, copy that, and we're going to say our book like that. And that'll have a type. There we go. So there's our book input type. All right, so far so good. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually set up our resolve function to do our insert book operation. So we'll come into here and we're going to say resolve. Now we want to pull the data here off of our args. So the args are the second parameter there. And we'll simply just destructure the book off of there. And then we'll have our implementation here for our resolve function. So now for this, we're going to have to do another fetch operation to actually do the inserting of the book. And then we can return back the book that we have, in fact, just inserted. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say fetch. And this is going to be a collection URL. So we'll just say, boom, localhost 3010. There we go, /books. And then we're going to specify some options. So we'll have our method, which is going to be a post. Headers. So then we'll have content, type, application, JSON, boom. And then here we're going to specify our body, which is going to be our actual book data. So we'll take book, JSON stringify, whoops. Boom, there we go. Now the result that we're going to get back here needs to be process or res JSON. And what we're actually going to be getting back here is the actual book ID is going to be what it's going to return back to us, right? So we will take our book ID here. It's going to be, say, result. And then we're going to have to load a book based upon that ID that we're going to get back. So we'll take our little fetch operation here again. Obviously, in a real application, you would refactor this a whole lot. But we'll come into here, and we're going to say fetch, and then we'll just add our little result.id here at the end. So far, so good. And then we'll just repeat our res JSON operation, and that's going to pull back our new book data. Okay. So now what we've done is we've make a little REST service operation to actually insert our book. We get the new ID back. We're going to go ahead and query that book. And then when you make the mutation, you can actually query this book type to be able to get back the return fields that you want. So if you just want the ID, you can just get that. But if you want to get an entire book, including the author and other stuff like that, you can do that as well. So let's go ahead and save all of this. We have our mutation type now. So if we come over to here and we reload, come into here, you'll see we have mutation. Inside of here, we have insert book and our book input. If you come into here, here's all of our fields. So now we'll quickly write a little mutation query to actually be able to insert that particular book. So we'll come into here, and we're going to say mutation, and then we'll just call it insert book. This is just the operation name. We're going to actually pass in the book that we want to insert. So this will be our insert, actually our book input. Yep, book input's what we called it, not in out, input. All right, and then here, we're going to specify our book as part of our book parameter here. So there's our book. And I'm going to pull back the ID, title, price, author, first name information after I do the insert, assuming the insert is successful, of course, and I haven't made a typo. So coming into here, we can do our book, and then we can specify our various values. Now, the actual query variables have to be in a valid JSON format, which means double quotes around all the actual property names. So we'll simply say title, new book, webinar, comma, and then we'll have our genre. See how quick the IntelliSense is there? So actually, no, we had, let's see, what were category, sorry. So category, we'll just say tech book, whatever. And we'll have our price, and we'll make it for $10.99. And then we'll do our final one, which is going to be our author ID, and we'll specify author number 1. Okay, so here's our query variables all set up. Here's our mutation. Let's go ahead and run our code. Let's take a look here. We have an error message. So one of the cool things about GraphQL is when you try to do something on your schema and it's not valid, it gives you back an error message, and then you can handle the errors. Okay. Now the reason this failed was I had book here, but guess what I didn't change? I did not change this to be insert book. So this field name here has to correspond to the actual field you're calling on your mutation, or of course it will not work. So let's take that, paste that in like that. Let's go ahead and run it now. Let's see what happens. All right, we have fetch is not identified. So this is kind of interesting. This, instead of being a schema issue, is actually a JavaScript issue. And the problem that I have is that I never imported fetch. So if we head back over to book type, we'll grab our import fetch from node fetch. You can see you've got really good error handling being provided to you by just the built-in GraphQL stuff. And of course, you'd want to do your own server-side error handling as well, writing stuff out to logs and things like that. But you can see the GraphQL stuff is pretty robust out of the box, which is really nice. So now if we were to come back into here, let's try it again, run our query. All right, our insert book came back as null. So we have a problem here. Something about our return data didn't quite work out the way we were expecting it to. So the first thing we'll do, let's go over to db.json. One nice thing about the JSON server is that it actually updates the db.json file for you whenever you make changes. So we can actually see, did our insert itself actually work? And take a look. Our insert actually did work. It is there listed. So the question becomes, what's the issue? I think the problem is, over here when I wrote my mutation code, and I said result.id, I probably should have just said result and not said ID at all. So what we'll do is we'll simply take that out. But because I don't trust myself, I'm going to put a set of curly braces around that. And I'm just going to output to the console the actual result value that we are getting here. And let's hear console. Actually, hold on, wait a second. If you take a look here, I know the problem. My code was actually right. But you know what I forgot to do? If you take a look down here, one nice thing about the JSON server too, it gives you a full logging of all of your requests. You can see my request actually did work. So I shouldn't have second-guessed myself. Instead, what I should have done was put a return statement in front of the fetch. If you don't return back the promise, then GraphQL doesn't know to wait for the result to then populate the data for the book type. There you go. So now we'll come back over to here. We can run this code again. Let's do new webinar book 2, and we'll make this be $11.99. Let's run it. Hey, there's our data. Not only did it give me back the data for the book, but it actually allowed me to query the author off of that, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so there's an example of our mutation query in action. And as you saw from a couple of my mistakes, dealing with errors and debugging and stuff, especially with the way I have it set up here, is actually pretty easy to do. It's pretty cool. So anyways, there's the mutation query. Let me move this over to here so you'll have an example of this query if you ever go back to take a look at this. So we'll paste that in. Boom. And then I'll grab the actual book data there. So I know it's a little bit after 1. I think I've answered one of the questions that we've received. This other question that I received, let me click on this here, is how do you handle performance hit? So the question is you notice on all these resolves, as it resolves, it has to go back to the REST service to get data. In this demonstration, I'm not really focusing in on what you would do to really resolve some of these performance issues. Clearly, going back to the REST service for each individual author would not be ideal. You'd have to write additional code behind the scenes to optimize those operations. GraphQL itself really doesn't care how you get the data. It just cares that the data shows up in the right structure. So in the course of our example here, we're really just demonstrating the GraphQL structure, not necessarily every implementation detail that would go into a JavaScript-based GraphQL service. You'd have to implement other code to take care of things like caching and batching together REST service calls and stuff like that into your application. So the last thing I want to do here before we take off, I was going to build one more endpoint for you with cars, but we're going to use the books, and we're going to update a little React component that I coded up ahead of time and populate with some data so you can actually see what it would look like to make a REST server, or not a REST service, but a GraphQL request from a web page. Not using any of the popular libraries, but just simply using the built-in fetch operation. So I'm going to jump over to, actually we'll stick with our editor here. I'm going to come over to a file that I've created in our client thing, app.js. All right. And so what we're going to do is we're going to switch out cars here and just display books. So I had a little sample example of some car data. I'm just simply going to change this to books, and we'll display a bunch of book data. So we'll do title, category, author, and price. That'll work. Now down here, we're going to iterate over our books that we're going to pass in. For each book, we'll have the ID. And then I'm just going to modify this to say book.title, book.category, and then we'll do our book.author.firstname, and then we'll do a second one to actually grab the last name too. Perfect. And then finally, we'll do book.price. Okay, cool. So there's our actual book information. There's our component for displaying our books. I'll come down here and just change this to books. Books. Now, we need to get our data here for displaying the books. And what we're going to do is just simply wrap this React DOM render inside of a fetch call. So we'll say fetch. And then we're going to hit our little GraphQL server. So we'll say localhost. I actually have this set up to go through I actually have it set up as a proxy through my Webpack dev server. And off GraphQL, we're going to call that URL. And then we're going to have to specify some data to go up with the query. So we can come into here and say method post. And then we can say headers. Content type. This is going to be application JSON. And then finally, we'll have our actual body of data that we're going to send up. And we'll say JSON stringify. And then into this, we're going to pass in a bunch of information. So there's our actual fetch request. Then we'll have ourselves a then, say res.json, process the JSON that comes back. And then finally, .then, and we'll have our actual data here. Actually, we'll say results. And then inside of here, we'll take our results. If you take a look over here at the way this comes back, it actually comes back as data. So then data dot whatever. If we were to come into here and do our query, books, title, get rid of our variables there, run it, you'll see it comes back with data.books. So I'm going to come into here and I'm going to say results.data.books. You should be able to pull that in there. Now we need to specify our query. Now the way that this is going to be done is if you come over to here, I'm going to show you a little trick. I'm going to open up my developer tools and go to network. I'm going to click on this and you'll see there's our actual query that we made. If you come down here, you can actually see the payload. So this is what the actual payload that is sent to the server. So if you take this and we drop it in there like that, it's actually already in a JSON format. But I'm going to switch it over to a regular object and then stringify it. If you take it like this, you can actually see what your query looks like that you send up to the server. And so you're going to have a query property, and then you're going to have a variables property. Now in this case, of course, we don't have any variables, so we don't have to worry about trying to pass any variables up. But now we can come in here and simply specify our query. So it's that same query syntax you saw before, variables, and then stringifying it. Let's put a colon there for our headers. And comma for that. So now we've got our actual fetch operation. You can see down here where it actually retrieved our books. And if everything worked correctly, should be able to come over here. Let's see what our issue is. Console, let's see, first name of undefined. And the reason we're not getting all of that is because I didn't specify all my fields. Let's say category, and then price, and author, first name, and last name. There we go. So now, when you write your query, you got to remember to actually include all your stuff. Down here, going back to the performance question we had, you can see all the individual little queries to pull in the authors. So now if we come back over to our browser window, there's our table of data. And we're actually able to specify the information that we wanted, which is really cool and makes working with GraphQL a huge advantage over working with traditional REST services. Of course, like anything else, there's always stuff that you have to kind of work out in terms of pulling all the data together in an optimal and efficient way. But GraphQL definitely solves the problem of how to have an API for your data services. Okay, with that said, let me flip back over to here real quick. Let's go actually first to our editor. You'll notice we had a key error. Make sure you include ID in your query. So all of this is here, and all this will get pushed up to GitHub. Let me jump back over to PowerPoint. So we kind of walked through all these different features. And the code is going to be available here at this GitHub address. So if you want to write that down, you can go out. I'll push the code up shortly after the webinar is over, and then a recording of this and the slide deck and other things will be made available to you. Let's go ahead. I've got one additional question that I haven't answered, and then if anybody else has questions, we can do those up until 1:30. So how does GraphQL work with Redux? That's an interesting question. So in terms of the server-side part of GraphQL, there's really nothing to do with Redux because Redux is a client thing in the web browser. GraphQL, in terms of the server part, is a server thing on the server. When you go to query the GraphQL server, querying the GraphQL server is like making a REST service query from the standpoint of Redux. It's basically you have an initiating action, and then you have a second action that runs once the query completes and it has data, and then that data can then be passed in via an action to the store, and the reducer can run and update the state, and then the components can re-render themselves and stuff like that. That being said, though, Apollo actually supports using Redux as the store mechanism for storing all of your data that you're pulling down from a GraphQL server. So while Redux has no direct connection to GraphQL, they kind of solve different problems. You can use Redux as part of your overall solution, with GraphQL being your source of data, and then Redux still being the tool that you use to manage your state. But at the end of the day, the GraphQL queries are in the realm of action creation, not really so much in the realm of managing your state or handling or the actual code in your reducers, that type of thing. If you have more interest in that in terms of integrating it with Redux, take a look at the Apollo project. It's actually a really cool project. All right. Any other questions from anybody on anything related to GraphQL at all? Okay, it looks like we're all done then. I want to thank you guys very much for being a part of the webinar. Sorry for the slides not showing for the first couple of minutes, but you should get a copy of the slide deck and you can go back and take a look at those slides. It was just really some highlight information. The real core of this was the actual live coding. So hopefully that was helpful to everybody. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address, again, which is on the first slide, which I'll flip back to, is right here, eric@t4d.io.com. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have on GraphQL, React, Angular, JavaScript programming in general. I'm always happy to answer questions from people who attend webinars and attend the classes that I teach. And you know, if you're interested in any type of training or things like that, reach out to WebAge. WebAge is one of the great training companies out there and can provide for you all types of training solutions, from in-person, online. I know they do a number of different things, providing official industry certifications through those vendors. WebAge is a great company. They do a lot of training in Canada and the United States, and so probably around the world too. So reach out to them if you have any training needs, and they'd be more than happy to help you. And thank you guys so much for attending today's webinar. Best of luck.